Once again this week, we continue to read from the Sermon on the Mount and these antitheses. Jesus saying, "You have heard that it was said," and then he goes back and references the Old Testament. And it's very difficult reading as well because it's hard to do anything he's saying us to do, right? I say to you, offer no resistance to one who is evil. When someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn the other one as well. And as he goes through his antitheses, as he goes and says this, what's really coming down to is what he's telling us to do is to love our neighbor as ourself. We hear about this in our first reading today as well from Leviticus. Take no revenge and cherish no grudge against any of your people. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. But this is very difficult to do. A little bit of put a perspective here when he says, to someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn the other one as well. What this actually is referring to is if someone strikes you on the right cheek, that's almost like they're insulting you. That you slap across the face on the right cheek, and so he's saying, take that other insult as well. Respond in charity. If anyone wants to go to law with you over your tunic, hand over your cloak as well. And this is ridiculous. Actually, what that means is anyone wants to go to law with you over your undergarments. Like, really? Right? Hand over your cloak as well. So to impress you in a service for 1 mile, go for 2 miles. And we see an example of this actually with Simon of Cyrene, who helps Jesus carry his cross. He's pressed into that service by the Roman soldiers. And so he goes ahead and goes and does this. He serves. And so what we're called to do as well. So we have that. We see this connection of that we're called to respond in charity, not to respond in revenge or in bitterness. Probably the hardest thing he tells us to do, though, in the gospel is what? But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That's hard. It's hard to love your enemies. If someone has insulted you, if someone has wronged you, if someone has hurt you or hurt your family, and you hear this, what emotions come up? Like, that just doesn't make sense, to love your enemies. But he goes on to say, even the tax collectors do the same. So what's the difference between a tax collector, what's the difference between a pagan, a Gentile, he's saying, even an evil one, and someone who's going to be a Christian, someone who's going to follow Christ? One of the biggest differences is, do we love our enemies or not? What does it mean to love? It's important to note, love is not a feeling. I think we get caught up sometimes, I feel so good when I'm around this person. All right, that's an emotion, that's a feeling. That's not necessarily love. To love someone is actually an action. And what you're doing is you're choosing the good for the other person. You're choosing the good. So it is an act of the will. It is a choice. To love someone means you're making that choice, that you want the betterment for them. You want the good for them, even for your enemies as well. Jesus goes on to say we want to pray for those who persecute us. And this is a great thing to do. I don't want to understate this. I know that personally when I've been persecuted or I felt like I've been wronged or attacked or whatever else it may be, and I pray for that person, it's a lot better. I don't hold that resentment against them as much. So it's important to pray for those who persecute us, but to love them, to choose the betterment for them, to choose the good is a hard thing to do, but it's one, if we do it, it's actually going to free us ourselves from this bitterness and this anger that we're maybe holding on to, as the first reading says as well, that causes us to sin. Their sin causes us to sin, so we're holding on to this resentment. I want to use an example, a story that I've read, and it's from a book, which I think I've referenced before, but it's always good to point out again. It's a book by Alan Hunt. It's called Everybody Needs to Forgive Somebody. It's a very short book. It's about 11 chapters, maybe, I don't know, how many pages is it? Not many, 88 pages. And it's 11 stories of forgiveness. And usually I buy them by the caseload, and I'd love to give everyone a copy, but my case is kind of low right now. But it's a good book. I think that costs $2, so a very expensive book here, right? But it's a great book telling about stories of forgiveness. Not only that, but it also has some exercises in there and how we can work on that forgiveness. And to forgive someone, of course, is an act of love. And we know it's hard to forgive someone. especially to forgive your enemies, those who have wronged you. But there's a story of a family, the Ten Boom family, who grew up in Holland during World War II. And they were Christians, and they hid Jewish people in their house. And so when the Nazis came looking, that they could hide them. Well, one day the Nazis did come looking for Jewish people, and they hid them in the house, and they were able to escape. The Jewish people were able to escape. However, the Ten Boom family was not able to escape. They locked them up because they suspected that this is what they were doing. And so they sent them off to consecration camps. The father, Casper, age 84, died 10 days later. And his daughters, Corey and her sister Betsy, were eventually transferred to the famous Ravensbrück concentration camp near Berlin, where Betsy died 10 months later. Remarkably, Corey was released from Ravensbrück through a clerical error, and she quickly returned home to her native Holland, where she was determined to help those who had suffered. After the war, Corey began receiving invitations from Christian groups in other countries, asking her to speak about her inspiring experiences of rescue, courage, and survival. As she was completing one of these talks, Corey was stunned to see a man who she immediately recognized as one of the feared guards she had known at Ravensbrück. Her mind immediately flashed back to her own suffering and to the loss of her family. In her own words, "One moment I saw the overcoat and the brown hat, the next a blue uniform and a visored cap with its skull and crossbones. It came back with a rush, the huge room with its harsh overhead lights, the pathetic pile of dresses and shoes in the center of the floor, the shame of walking naked past this man." Corey's mind fixated once again on the horror she had experienced at Ravensbrück. Now standing years later in a place very far away, she recoiled from this man who was making his way forward. He had not merely been a Ravensbrück guard, he had been one of the most cruelest guards of all. The man threw out his hand to greet Corey. "A fine message, Fraulein. How good it is to know that you, as you say, all our sins are at the bottom of the sea." The moment of confrontation forced Corey to reflect on her own speech and what she had spoken so easily of forgiveness. Forgiveness that seemed to easily describe now presented itself in a very difficult form right before her eyes. She fumbled in her pocketbook rather than take that outstretched, cruel hand, anything to grab a moment to allow her heart and her mind to settle down. As she remembered her dead sister, the fear that had captivated them at the camp, and the horrors of so many people starving to death or being executed in gas showers. Sheer revulsion for those who had imprisoned her washed over her, saturating her body and mind. "You will not remember me, of course," Corey said later. How could he remember one prisoner among those thousands of women? But I remember him, the leather crop swinging from his belt. I was face to face with one of my captors, and my blood seemed to freeze. The guard spoke to Corey. "You mentioned Ravensbrück in your talk. I was a guard there." And Corey realized that he did not recognize or remember her or her family. While he had no memory of her, she remembered him vividly. His words prattled out. "Since that time, I've become a Christian. I know that God has forgiven me for the cruel things I did there, but I would like to hear it from your lips as well. Fraulein, will you forgive me?" Again, he extended his hand, reaching out to her own. Corey found herself sucked into a vortex of emotions and memories. I stood there, I whose sins had again and again been forgiven, and could not forgive. Betsy had died in that place. Could he erase her slow, terrible death simply for the asking? It could not have been many seconds that he stood there, hand held out, but to me it seemed hours as I wrestled with the most difficult thing I had ever had to do. The gravity of the moment paralyzed Corrie ten Boom. This courageous woman who had risked her life so courageously now found herself incapable of responding to a man who had asked her that simple question, "Will you forgive me?" She knew the answer, but she struggled to find the words. For I had to do it. I knew that. The message, God forgives, is a prior condition, that we forgive those who have injured us. You do not forgive men their trespasses, Jesus says. Neither will your Father in heaven forgive your trespasses. It was clear. Corrie not only had to forgive this man, she also needed to forgive him. For his sake and for her own. The door to a healthy future felt locked, but she knew forgiveness provided the key, if only she could muster the strength to offer it. Corrie said, I knew it was not only a commandment of God, but as a daily experience. Since the end of the war, I had a home in Holland for victims of Nazi brutality. Those who were able to forgive their enemies were able also to return to the outside world and rebuild their lives, no matter what the physical scars. Those who nursed their bitterness remained invalids. It was as simple and as horrible as that. It was almost as if God was showing her that choice was real. Choose forgiveness and unlock your door to a new life, healing in your future. Deny forgiveness and remain locked in the prison cell of your bitter memories that will ultimately destroy you. Corrie reached out. And so woodenly, mechanically, I thrust my hand into the one stretched out to me. And as I did, an incredible thing took place. The current started in my shoulder, raced down my arm, sprang into our joined hands. And then this healing warmth seemed to flood my whole being, bringing tears to my eyes. Extending her hand, offering her heart, and sharing forgiveness, Corrie ten Boom flung open the door that had been locked shut for so many years. I forgive you, brother, she cried, with all my heart. And in the words of Corrie, for a long moment we grasped each other's hands, the former guard and the former prisoner. I'd never known God's love so intensely as I did then. Love your enemy is a choice that we have to make. But in doing so, we're experiencing this freedom from the bonds of hatred and bitterness that maybe we can hold on to, this resentment as well, as Corrie said, locked in this prison. And so when Jesus says to love your enemies as yourself, we know that it's not only what he says, it's what we must do as well. It's hard. It's hard to do, but the choice is ours. And if we do so, we then will experience that freedom and that love, and the love that we've never experienced so intensely, so we're able to love our enemies as ourselves.